Welcome, everyone, to Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We're your hosts and co-founders of FantasyForesight.com, coming to you from the Rambo Fixture Company studios. I'm Ben.
And I'm Jay.
You ready to get rolling, Jay?
You know it. Let's do this.
All right, let's go. Welcome in, everyone. It is Tuesday, September 15th. We've got our guy Steve at FF_encyclopedia. And wow, is it great to have the NFL back. In this episode, we'll be reviewing all our week one buys and sells, looking at a 25 quick hitter week one takeaways from around the league, an injury update from Jay, and he's already told me it's unfortunately a long list, and we'll finish up with a week two waiver ads discussion with Steve. Lots to get to. How you doing tonight, Jay?
Like you said, Ben, a lot to get to, so I'll be brief. It was a wet and wild week one. You know, of my four major teams that I care about in the most competitive leagues there are, my favorite two rosters picked up losses. My least favorite two rosters both got wins. So it's fantasy football season. What can you expect? Steve, how are you doing tonight, my friend?
You know, I'm doing pretty well, all things considered. I was texting Ben a little bit earlier this morning, and, you know, with the Browns losing and me dropping every single one of the fantasy teams I care about, it really can only go up from here. So, hey.
Hey, as an Eagles fan, after that kind of loss to the Redskins, I'm right there with you. Dwayne
Washington
Haskins,
football
comeback
team.
player of the year. Yes, Washington football team.
But yes, you're right. But you got to remember, you're talking to a couple Browns fans. So we're over here licking our wounds like we expected to after week one, like we have to do every year. But, you know, it's fantasy football is back, and all things considered, the Browns loss hit me a little lighter than it would have normally because, you know, football's back and it's just so much fun to watch all these games. And so like we said, we've got a lot to get to, so without further ado, we'll dive right into it. Quick disclaimer, if this is your first time listening, just know that we are speaking in terms of single QB, full PPR redraft by default, and all of our fantasy finishes, as well as fantasy points per game calculations, are all based on full PPR, limited to weeks 1 through 16, according to fantasypros.com. First up, let's try our absolute best to fly through our 22 total week one buys and sells, going back to Thursday night football, where Total Foresight, Jay, and myself all bought both of these guys. Kansas City Chiefs quarterback and tight end Pat Mahomes and Travis Kelce. We were going against an aggregate projection of QB2 for Pat Mahomes and an aggregate projection of tight end 1 for Travis Kelce. Steve, you know, he rightfully sold both of those. Travis sold Travis Kelce. And as expected, Houston was playing behind most of the game, which allowed rookie running back Clyde Edwards-Helaire to take over in the second half. Thus, Mahomes didn't live up to QB2 and Kelce didn't live up to tight end 1. However, you confidently trot them out every week and you don't think twice about it. The better the Chiefs' competition, the better the fantasy outlook for Mahomes and Kelce, because they'll be needed that much more those weeks. The Chiefs are at the Chargers in week 2, so there may be similar occurrences for Kelce and Mahomes next week because the Chargers offense did almost nothing against the Bengals. So if the Chiefs get up on them fast like they did with Houston, it could be another monster CEH second half.
I'll tell you what, Ben, Travis Kelce finished tight end 4 overall. That's not too far off from tight end 1. I don't feel too bad about that. Pat Mahomes finishing as QB 14. That's probably a little disappointing to Pat Mahomes owners, but you know, he's not too far off that 50 touchdown pace for the season. So still gotta love that.
You got it. 211 yards passing, still 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. And Travis Kelce caught 6 passes on 6 targets for 50 yards and a touchdown. So both grade A production. And like I said, if they get better competition, you're going to get better fantasy outlooks from them. Steve, you got anything to add about either of those two before we move on?
No, I think you pretty much covered it right there.
Thank you, sir. Next up, we've got Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver Sammy Watkins. He was another Total Foresight buy versus an aggregate projection of wide receiver 46. Steve, surprisingly, was the only one to sell. He was the only one that got that wrong because the rest of us got that right, because Sammy Watkins ended up being wide receiver 10. None of us were calling for that, but we were definitely calling for him to be wide receiver 46. He had 7 catches on 9 targets for 82 yards and a touchdown. This was one of the sweetest buys of the week for me. I planted my flag in the offseason for Sammy over Mecole Hardman through week 1. That sure looks correct. The numbers research proved very accurate in this one. We told you in the preseason that Sammy averaged 9+ targets per game before Pat Mahomes got hurt last season. And what he see in week 1? 9 targets. That led the team and represented a 28% target share. The target leader in Pat Mahomes' offense is all you need to hear every week. He too gets the charges in their defense in week 2, but with Kelsey and Tyreek and now CEH out there attracting attention on defense, I expect Sammy to be open all season long. So as long as he can stay healthy, sky's the limit for Sammy Watkins.
And you said it, Ben, as long as he can stay healthy, Sammy's going to do what Sammy can do. And boy, he really showed us in week 1. It's just, you always wait for that other shoe to drop with Sammy. But until that happens, ride him strong.
And guys, that was really my main hesitancy of wanting to buy Watkins in week 1, was just even leading up to the game and throughout training camp. He was nursing, as he always seems to, some kind of soft tissue injury. And I don't know. I just didn't have faith in him, but prove me wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, you can't blame Steve.
And, there was a lot of that going around in week 1, Steve. That certainly was not isolated to you. Jay talked about in his favorite leagues, he went 2-2. In my favorite leagues, my 3 favorite leagues, I went 2-1, but I still felt extremely humbled with what I expected to happen versus what actually happened. So, you're definitely not the only one, brother. And trust me, you're going to see that coming up here in a little bit. Next up, we have Houston Texans wide receiver Randall Cobb, who was a total Foresight buy versus an aggregate projection of wide receiver 67, just wide receiver 67. We all bought unanimously along with total Foresight, and we were all wrong. He ended up being wide receiver 83 overall, just caught 2 catches on 3 targets for 23 yards. Wide receiver 67 is so easy to beat, and it sure looked like the Texans could have used some more wide receiver help, so I'm not sure why he wasn't used and targeted more. Better days could be ahead for Cobb, but I just refuse to trust the Bill O'Brien-led offense anymore. Cobb is droppable, and there are far better wide receiver options both in week 2 and beyond.
I'll say this. It's a saying that I say year in and year out. 1 week does not a champion make, and 1 week does not a champion break. However, I don't want to get too high and too low on a guy, but when you have a game script where you're behind most of the game and you're forced to throw and you wind up with 3 targets and 2 catches, you're off my radar until you prove otherwise.
Yep, that's exactly it. If you aren't going to produce a startable effort in this contest, when would you ever feel confident?
Exactly, Steve. Yeah. So
great points, guys.
Yeah, I hope Cobb can come back and prove us wrong and get back on track, but until he does, he's off my radar until then.
Absolutely. Next up, in our first sell of the week for Total Foresight, we were looking at Houston Texans quarterback Deshaun Watson. He was aggregate projected QB3, and he was a sell because Total Foresight liked him just slightly behind that at QB5. But in reality, he ended up being QB12, 20 completions on 32 attempts for 253 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, added like he does 6 rushing attempts, 27 yards, and 1 touchdown on the ground. Every single one of us except Steve was selling this one. Steve was the only one that bought. Steve got this one wrong, but Steve ended up with a better record than me this week, so I'm not going to bust on him too much. I love Deshaun Watson, but we saw this coming in week 1. He and that offense sure looked like they missed the guy who single-handedly caught more week 1 passes for the Cardinals than all the Texans wide receivers combined. Better days will be ahead for Deshaun because he's just that good and that high character of a guy. But he hosts the Ravens in week 2 and travels to Pittsburgh in week 3. Ooh. Heading into week 4, Deshaun Watson may not be a top 12 scoring fantasy quarterback, and his team may be staring down the barrel of an 0-3 record. Yikes. I blame Bill O'Brien.
There you go. And well said. You obviously should. But yeah, but Deshaun, I mean, look, he was still a QB 12 overall, so a QB 1 on the books, and still a fine performance. But like we mentioned with Randall Cobb, when you have that game script, even though it's going to take him a little bit of time to get in sync with his new wide receiving core, even though so many of them are returning, you know, they got to figure things out, and it was tough going. Ben, you mentioned it, though. You might as well chalk him down for the sell for the next 2 weeks going against the Ravens and Steelers, because it's not going to get any better for him.
Hey, I will say, after selling the entire Texans offense throughout the rest of the episode when we were doing this, I tried to weasel my way out of my buy, but yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, yeah, I just thought with the game script, even without Hopkins, that you know, he would just find a way because he's Superman, and you know, yeah, we all saw the same thing, guys, and it was a rough go for that Houston Texans team, no doubt.
For sure. Next up, we have Kansas City wide receiver Tyreek Hill. Total Foresight and the four of us all sold, and we were all correct. Woo! He was aggregate projected wide receiver 4. He ended up being wide receiver 25. He caught 5 receptions on 6 targets for 46 yards and 1 touchdown, which saved his week. With Tyreek Hill, it almost feels like they only use him if they feel they need him. He's a must start, but you need to analyze his weekly matchups to manage your expectations, because even though he got in the end zone in week 1, he was a wide receiver 3 this week and not the wide receiver 4 overall that he was projected to be. His peaks are worth it, but buckle up and hold on tight, because rostering Tyreek can certainly be a roller coaster ride.
God, he's a guy I would love to have in my flex, but if he's your wide receiver 1, the unpredictability is just, you know, it's tough to stomach some weeks, and this goes to show it.
No, and hey, that's what I said on the podcast. I was like, hey, he could finish there this year. He'll have weeks where he is the wide receiver 1, but I will sell it every single week because it's only going to be a handful of times.
Yep.
And, you know, so
Tyreek Hill in your flex, Jay. I love the fantasy greed. I'm right there with you, and I am here for it.
Thank you.
I know, I'm laughing to myself. I'm like, I love that.
He's just that.
Everybody would.
He's just that type of player is I perfect for a flex spot, a home run hitter, and that's what he is. But he's overvalued because now I got to have him in my WR1 spot.
For sure, absolutely. It was just hilarious because that's just how we are. We text on the side about being so fantasy greedy, and that was just a great example. and I absolutely.
Hey, I'm going to try to make it happen, though. Don't you worry.
Oh, of course. And next up, as my dog Riggins continues to make background noise for everyone, we have got Kansas City Chiefs rookie running back Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Our guy Travis Sumter, who was on with us last week, made sure to let me know via social media live on this podcast to remind everyone he was the only one pounding the table for CEH. He was the only one buying. Total Foresight was selling. We all were selling. It was an aggregate projection of RB9. He ended up finishing his RB11 with 25 attempts, 138 rushing yards, 5.5 yards per carry, 1 touchdown, but surprisingly just 2 targets. Like I said, we all sold. Total Foresight sold. We were all wrong because, he ended up being, oh no, wait a minute.
We're all right.
I'm so distracted by my dog. Travis was the only one that was wrong on this one. We were technically right, but conceptually wrong. Number 1, CEH saw 25 carries versus Darrell Williams 7. Number 2, he finished as an RB1 despite only seeing those 2 targets. With a little more involvement in the passing game, the sky is the absolute limit with CEH, considering his beastly compact and efficient running style, and considering that he's the primary goal line running back in Pat Mahomes' offense. The wait and see is over. I am all in on CEH. Dude is fun to watch.
I found that it was going to be hard to imagine another rookie running back bursting onto the scene in Kansas City, but that's exactly what we have. And it's amazing to think that he had 138 rushing yards and a touchdown, but only finished as RB11. That's a pretty good day at the office, but you're right. Really, the only concerning part was his lack of involvement in the passing attack, but, you would think that that's going to improve as the season continues.
Yeah, precisely, guys. I think we'll definitely see him get more and more involved. And you like seeing that they weren't afraid of giving him goal line carry after goal line carry. You would have liked to see him punch in another one, or maybe
Yep.
two of those. But hey, that was his role and his job. So yeah, CEH all season long.
Steve,
Yeah.
I think he intentionally didn't punch one of those others in just to make us right and start off on a good note on the Fantasy Foresight podcast.
That's the best way.
Right.
We don't believe in you.
Right.
You're right, but you make us right in the process. Like, yeah, we appreciate that,
Exactly.
CH. Friend of show, and let's have a nice, long, happy relationship. Next up, we have got Houston Texans wide receiver Will Fuller.
Ugh.
Total Foresight and everyone but me was selling his aggregate projection of wide receiver 36. That was wrong because he ended up being wide receiver 14, catching 8 balls on 10 targets for 112 yards. Did not get in the end zone, but well, Jay is going to have his DJ victory lap. But first, he gets to listen to my Lone Ranger victory lap about Will Fuller. He looked like the only Texans wide receiver who ever played football before. There was just no separation anywhere else, and the defense was keying on him every time Watson dropped back. If Fuller can stay healthy, that man is a rock solid wide receiver 2 for me the rest of the season, based purely on target volume alone. I mean, he had 31% target share in week 1, and I just don't necessarily see that changing all that much throughout the year, barring injury, of course.
Man, you know what? Fine. Will Fuller, you had one of your big weeks. Good for you. Congratulations on being WR68 next week. Fantastic. Whatever. Give me the loss and let's move on.
Hey, I will say this. My primary reason for selling was, there's no DeAndre Hopkins, and I just really didn't think that he could have the day that he had. So I have to say, hey, I'm wrong. Kudos to Will Fuller. If he is healthy and on the field, that 31% target share in that offense, I mean, that's going to be lethal for people that have him in their lineup. But, we'll see how far he makes it through the season. I do wish him the best, though.
Very, very
Absolutely.
Nice, Steve. Very
Yes,
nice. Taking the high road.
Steve-O.
I'm not taking the high road.
And like I made
good
my
luck,
point
hammies.
on the previous podcast, it was week 1. We'll see if I buy him every other week that he's on this podcast. But for week 1, I wasn't worried about the injury concern. So next up, this one shocked me. Kansas City Chiefs wide receiver Mecole Hardman. He was up against an aggregate projection of wide receiver 68. Total Foresight, Jay, myself, Steve, we all sold except Travis. Travis got this one right. We got it wrong. Period. He ended up being wide receiver 111. I'm sorry, 112. Mecole Hardman ended up being wide receiver 112. All you had to do was be wide receiver 68. And not only did you not do that, you didn't come anywhere close to even wide receiver 73, our projection. I mean, it's bad. It's one of those times where you got to listen to Total Foresight, and Travis, we should have listened to Travis too. I mean, 1 target for Mecole, 1 target. What is going on? I mean, I don't know, but for all you out there who drafted Hardman banking on him playing like, say, Sammy Watkins, you better adjust because you just can't fake target share. Wide receiver 68 is so easy to beat. 1 target is simply alarming. I'm 100% off Mecole Hardman until we see a vast shift in his usage, regardless of the opponent. I mean, Demarcus Robinson saw 6 targets, man. If you're someone who still believes in Mecole, please contact me. I would love to hear the rationale.
And Demarcus Robinson saw red zone targets even, and I'm with you. I thought Mecole Hardman, who last year had more of a gadgety type role, was going to be more ingrained into this offense. It did not materialize. And even if he does bounce back in week 2 and has 6 or 8 targets, I think I'm going to need to see it 2 weeks in a row to see that it doesn't just disappear again in week 3. You're right, Ben. One of the more disappointing performances in week 1 for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, fellows. The game script didn't help him whatsoever, and I thought they would find ways to manufacture touches, but it just didn't come to fruition. And Jay, you make a great point. You have to see it for several weeks in a row before you could feel safe about putting him in your lineup. unless you're just absolutely desperate, which I hope you aren't in week 2 of your season, or it's going to be a long one.
Absolutely. And, the Houston Texans running backs, they're not worth talking about. We're just going to skip over those two, the DJ.
Nope. Stop delaying. Let's go.
Hey, I got out in front of this and I sent out my concession speech in public on Twitter to Jay that night. Houston Texans running back David Johnson was an incorrect sell for everyone, including Total Foresight on this podcast, except Jay. Congratulations, Jay. You were the only one that knew that David Johnson was going to beat his aggregate projection of RB17. He ended up as RB10. He had 11 attempts, 77 yards, and 1 touchdown on the ground. But what was surprising to me was that he had 3 receptions on 4 targets for 32 yards in the air in Bill O'Brien's offense. So, Jay, enjoy your victory lap. Congrats. I'll admit, I never could have foreseen intelligent decision-making coming from Bill O'Brien as it pertains to his running backs. That was my whole basis of fading DJ. Between that and durability, and to that point, there was that time on Thursday where DJ was on the sidelines being evaluated by trainers, but he came back and he played well, I will say. So if Bill is actually going to scheme his primary running back into targets for a change and even line him up out wide in the slot like we saw a couple of times, then DJ can absolutely go as far as his durability will take him this season. Congrats, Bill. Keep it up. The Texans will need a miracle to avoid an 0-2 start after they host the Ravens in week 2.
Why, thank you. I'm gonna enjoy this victory lap. David Johnson, in my opinion, he looked good, and you're right, he did take a shot to the arm, and you could tell he was a little bit nervous. He was flexing it like, oh no, did I do something to my wrist again? And he ended up being okay. And I got to tell you guys, I thought he looked dynamic. Having 3 catches on 4 targets isn't lighting the world on fire, but it is involved in the passing offense. And now with Duke Johnson getting nicked up as well, maybe he'll get a little bit more for the next couple weeks, and that he's gonna need some more opportunities because he's going up against some tough defenses. So to be fantasy relevant again, he's gonna have to cash in on those opportunities.
Yeah, I'm right there with both of you guys. I think, while we might disagree with where David Johnson might end or finish on a given week, we all thought he looked good. And as long as he's durable, I think the touches will be there and he'll be a very productive mid-range RB2, maybe even like a low-end RB1 on the season if he can, get there for sure.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see where his aggregate projections are the next 2 weeks with him facing such tough matchups. I mean, Ravens and Steelers, I can't think of a tougher back-to-back matchup for a running back to have. So good luck with that. But who's not going to have to worry about it is his teammate for the Houston Texans, running back Duke Johnson, the other DJ. I was the only one planting my flag for DJ. I was for Duke Johnson, I should say. I was buying the aggregate projection of RB36. Total Foresight, Jay, Steve, Trav, they were all right because he ended up being RB78. And he only had 5 attempts for 14 yards and 1 target. You know what? If Duke wouldn't have gotten hurt, I'm just kidding. I was way wrong about Duke. Bill O'Brien has never had a lead back that he values / trusts like he clearly does with David Johnson. Duke is currently droppable for me as he didn't practice Monday with the sprained ankle. And even if he does make it back for week 2, it's first the Ravens. Get well soon, Duke. I still love you.
I still love you too, Duke, but yeah, you're right. Now he's nicked up. We saw what the role was in week 1. Now he's going up against 2 tough defenses. It's just a bad formula for Duke Johnson the next couple weeks, but who knows? We'll see what happens after that.
Yeah, right there with you guys. I don't think he's rosterable right now.
And another disappointing performance to round out Thursday night.
Yeah, Houston Texans wide receiver Brandon Cooks, man, how the mighty have fallen. His aggregate projection was wide receiver 42, Total Foresight, and all 4 of us all agreed and were all correct to sell him. I hate saying this, but I'm just not sure how fantasy relevant Brandon Cooks is going to be this year. There's certainly opportunity for him to improve his chemistry with Deshaun Watson, but this was a positive game script for his fantasy relevance and the Texans, and he can only muster that line. I get that he was battling a quad, but his lack of durability is yet another concern for him moving forward. And in week 2, like we said, the Texans host the Ravens. So right now for me, he's nothing more than a wait and see bench stash. And I wouldn't even blame you if you dropped him.
You know what? I got to say, though, watching that game and seeing Cooks, I didn't expect much out of him coming in nursing an injury, but I actually thought he looked pretty decent, all things considered. So it was even more disappointing that, he seemed to be moving well, and there was that positive game script, and he just, it just wasn't there. So I think it's even more concerning for me, and yeah, I need to see him be productive, for a couple of weeks, and then I'll buy back in.
Yeah, I mean, once upon a time, it was death, taxes, and Brandon Cooks changing teams and getting 1,000 yards.
Yes.
The three certainties in life, and one of those has gone away, and it's sad.
It's not taxes. Taxes haven't gone away. No.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't have time to wait around to see if he's ever going to look like the old Brandon Cooks again, let alone stay healthy for more than a couple of weeks in a row. So it's unfortunate. We're big fans on this podcast, but it'll be I'll have to see a big difference in him before I buy again. Moving on to away from Thursday night to the rest of our buys and sells. And real quick before that, just to summarize how everybody did on Thursday night football buys and sells. Total Foresight went 7-5. Jay, congrats, you also went 7-5. Trav, congrats, you also went 7-5. Steve and I both sucked, and we were 6-6. So just one game difference, and everybody was 500 or over, which for week one, I'll take it. I was very upset and disappointed in texting Jay on Sunday and Monday that I wasn't perfect in every one of my my projections and expectations this season, but that's fantasy football, and that's just week one right there. So all in all, I'm satisfied with Total Foresight. That's the most important, being 7-5 with those, and we'll see how they did with the rest of the buys and sells.
And real quick, how did I console you, Ben? I told you what Vegas Sportsbook's margin is, and it's 4.5%. So they average being right about 55% of the time. So you know what? Going 7-5, beat Vegas. Woo!
That's right, man.
I'll open my own sports book.
I can't wait. Next up, we have. Let's see. We've got 1, 2, 3. We've got 6 buys and 4 sells from Total Foresight. And first, we had a Total Foresight buy in San Francisco 49ers quarterback Jimmy Garoppolo. His aggregate projection was QB 21, and we unanimously bought, along with Total Foresight, that projection, and we were correct, but we weren't as correct as I thought we would be. He was only QB 18 overall, went 19 of 33, 259 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, and it was a 20-24 loss to Arizona. And Jimmy G played well despite no Deebo Samuel and no George Kittle for a full half plus, with a full game of his primary pass catching stud in George Kittle. I'd suspect Jimmy G would have been a lot closer to that QB 11 that Total Foresight had him ranked at. However, even with limited weapons, Jimmy G and the Niners travel to the hapless Jets in week 2, so keep an eye on him once again.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, he was without a number of weapons and still was able to get it done and beat his aggregate projection. So good on him.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're playing the streaming game, Jimmy G is definitely somebody you want to keep in mind for next week.
Absolutely. Next up, we had another Total Foresight buy in Seattle Seahawks running back Chris Carson. His aggregate projection was RB 14, and everybody but Jay was correct to buy him.
Okay, what?
He actually finished as I didn't write that one down, but I believe it was RB 8 overall or RB 7 overall. One of those two. His Total Foresight rank was RB 8. And actually, I can look that up, and I will in a second. But he only had 21 rush yards on 6 attempts, but he also caught 6 passes on 6 targets for 45 yards receiving and had 2 receiving touchdowns. This was all in a 38-25 win over the Atlanta Falcons. And man, we were all right about Chris Carson. Well, everyone except Jay. And it was nice to see Carson healthy, back, and getting in the end zone a couple times through the air, I might add. However, as someone with him as my RB2 in the Fantasy Foresight Challenge, I was slightly concerned to see Hyde with 1 more carry 7 than Carson 6, and to see Hyde vulture a goal line carry that resulted in a rushing touchdown. However, Carson was clearly the best back on the field. He saw 75% of the running back targets, and he is still working his way back from a week 16 hip fracture. So he may well be onward and upward, and they might just be easing him in. But keep an eye on that carry distribution, because we all view him as more of a volume running back and less of a touchdown dependent guy. So we need to keep an eye on that to make sure that that's actually true. Chris Carson and the Seahawks are home versus the Patriots in week 2. So that's not the easiest matchup in the world either.
I cannot believe that I have to be the only one taking a loss on a guy who had 12 touches of the football and finished with 66 yards. And I have to lose because he finished somehow in the top 10? Ridiculous.
He's an end zone beast, man. And he was RB7 overall, and everyone, just for the record.
RB7 overall. Okay, and not to mention, he had 6 catches on 6 targets in a negative game script game. Like, whatever. Moving on.
I was going to say, that's something that does bode well for Chris Carson moving forward. And next week probably will be a little bit more of a positive running game script for sure. So maybe a tougher matchup, but hey, I would think he'll see an uptick in the carries he gets.
Yeah, and I think also Atlanta's defense just begs you to pass it against them.
Yeah.
So it's, and I expect Chris Carson's usage to go up as the season progresses, as we get farther and farther away from that week 16 injury also. And, Carlos Hyde's no slouch. So, I mean, if Chris Carson's anywhere behind 100%, why not use him a little bit? So, Yep. Moving on, we have got Pittsburgh Steelers running back James
I blame
Conner.
all of you for me taking the loss on this one.
Oh, why? Because you were impressionable?
You were
responsible for your own decisions on this podcast. James Conner was up against an aggregate projection of RB15. All 5 of us, including Total Foresight, got it wrong. He had 9 rushing yards on just 6 attempts. 2 receptions on 4 targets for just 8 yards, and a 26-16 win over the New York Giants. Did you watch this game? Benny Snell looked far and away better than James Conner, and it wasn't even close. I root for Conner as a person, but as a fantasy prospect, I'm done. I put my emotions aside and I bought in on him week 1, and poor guy couldn't even stay healthy for 1 week. The Steelers are at home versus Denver in week 2, and DH ran all over them last night. Benny Snell may be the number 1 waiver wire target in week 2. Right, fellas? I mean, wow.
Yep. Just wish he was available in our league of record.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Steve.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Twisting a knife.
And we'll talk about it more here shortly when we go for the waiver wire. But the last I heard, Mike Tomlin's gonna leave the light on for Mr. Conner to come back in week 2. So who
Conner's gonna still have to be capable of walking in the door, though. So
yeah, but he's Motel 6 in us with leaving that light on for us.
That's fine.
We gotta make sure there aren't any steps for him to get up and over.
Yeah, I mean, and God forbid anybody try and tackle the man. All right, so moving on to another egg on my face situation in Tampa Bay Buccaneers tight end Rob Gronkowski. He was up against an aggregate projection of tight end 9. Man finished as tight end 35, 2 receptions on 3 targets for 11 yards, and a 23-34 loss to the Saints. Total Foresight was the correct answer was to sell, and this was a buy for Total Foresight. This was a buy for me, and it was a buy for Total Foresight and myself, and we were on an island. Jay and Steve both sold. On our last pod, I said, until I see Gronk looking old and ineffective, I'm all in on Gronk. Well, I saw it. I was stubborn and I was wrong, and I can admit that. OJ Howard did finish as tight end 9, seeing 6 targets. He's the tight end to roster heading into week 2 as the Bucs return home to host the burnable Panthers defense. And Gronk only saw 3 targets. Like I said, Howard saw 6. And just 1 for Brate. So Brate's a non-factor. Gronk sadly seems like a non-factor just by pure capability at this point, which I'm shocked. I mean, I didn't think that at his age he would have already fallen off a cliff. I know he had a ton of injuries, but I really bought into the fact that year off really made him fresh and that he was still every bit of the athletic freak that he's always been. But like I said, I'm wrong. And unless him and Tom Brady go to some TB12 center and take some Fountain of Youth drugs that the rest of the world doesn't have yet, then I don't see anything changing down there in Tampa Bay.
I'm always concerned. You hear it a lot from former players that when you have the inkling in the back of your mind that it's time to hang it up, it's time to hang it up. So when a guy proactively chooses to walk away and then come back, you just wonder, what he has. Once the pads come on and the hits start, what's left in the tank. I don't know. It was just a situation where I wanted to see it. It just seemed too good to be true that he could just walk right back in and be the same old Gronk that we were always used to. So, doesn't seem like it's going to be the case.
Yep. I mean, I sold reluctantly, because I think like a lot of people, I'd like to see flashes of the old
Oh, it's
Gronk.
more fun. Absolutely.
We all love it. It's great for football, but
Yeah.
until further notice, I can't.
Oh, I'll tell you what, though. The next few are very disappointing.
Oh, absolutely. First up, you've got now controversial all of a sudden wide receiver for the Chicago Bears, Allen Robinson. His aggregate projection was wide receiver 16. He was a total Foresight buy. The rest of us bought as well, and we were all wrong because he ended up as wide receiver 33. 5 catches on 9 targets for 74 yards, no touchdowns, and it was in a 27-23 comeback win over Detroit. A-Rob had an amazing diving catch in this game and unfortunately couldn't haul in his lone red zone target in traffic. He still had a 25% target share. He looked like the beast that he is, and I still believe in A-Rob. But I did get a couple interesting sleeper alerts today. Reportedly, A-Rob is in the last year of his 3-year deal and has removed all Bears-related affiliations with his social media profiles. And then it was reported that he requested to be traded. Then, of course, his agent came out with the obligatory denial about that. But honestly, none of it scares me. A-Rob is going to want to ball out, whether he's in Chicago or anywhere else, especially if he's set on hitting the open market in 2021. And if the Bears are smart, they and his teammates will do everything they can to keep A-Rob happy. Better days are ahead for A-Rob, and it starts with week 2 at home versus the Giants.
Like you said, every week now for A-Rob is a job interview to the rest of the NFL. And you know what? I think the Bears should trade him, and they should trade him right on over to Philadelphia, who desperately needs receivers. We'd be happy to have him. So, but I mean, I'm still high on A-Rob. The only thing is, I just wish he had an accurate quarterback to throw him the ball, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, I just am going to say I agree with you guys as far as this was definitely a disappointing one because the table was set as far as you couldn't ask for a better opponent as far as a team that can put up some points, going to force you into throwing the ball. And who does Detroit have at cornerback? Like, I really can't name any of the guys. So right off the top of my head.
We'll see how things. Yeah, we'll see how things look on this Thursday night football. But if it doesn't look well, maybe we'll see if they would like Odell Beckham and some cash instead of A-Rob.
Hey, there you go.
We could just pay them both. It's just
Odell
fine.
will love playing with Mitch Trubisky. They'll get along.
Oh, it would be great.
Yeah.
It would be
2 peas in a pod there
as well. It would be inappropriate. Anyways, I digress. Moving on to the last buy of the week. Incorrect once again. Total Foresight, all of us bought into this guy as aggregate projected wide receiver 17, and we're talking about LA Chargers wide receiver Keenan Allen. Man, he was wide receiver 60, 4 receptions on 8 targets for 37 yards in a 16-13 win over Cincy. Man, Cincy's D was a lot better than people have been giving them credit for, holding the Chargers to just 16 points. Accuracy and chemistry was an issue all day for Tyrod Taylor, as he was only 53% accurate with his passes. And from a target share standpoint, Mike Williams surprisingly led the team in targets with 9, followed by Keenan Allen and Hunter Henry with 8 apiece. Equally surprising, the Chargers only had 1 running back target with Austin Eckler back there. It was just weird. I got to be honest, I'm a little perplexed by how this offense divvied up their touches in week 1, but Keenan Allen and all the Chargers pass catchers have a week 2 date at home versus Pat Mahomes and the Chiefs. Thus, there should be as much or much more pass volume next week, where I'll be viewing Keenan Allen as a middle-of-the-road wide receiver too. Accuracy and chemistry with Tyrod needs to be a focal point in practice this week, though.
You know what? You said the Bengals defense looked a lot better than we expected. It could just be because the Chargers offense is that bad. The path is not going to get any easier for the Chargers. And, Ben, you had touched on it before that Tyrod likes to check down and throw those short to intermediate routes. He doesn't really throw the ball deep a whole lot. And we kind of saw that materialize. Keenan Allen had 8 targets. That's not terrible, but when you're only catching at a 50% clip, the production is just not great. The lack of balls to Austin Eckler out of the backfield is very concerning. And right now, I want no part of this offense.
Yeah, I actually thought that this game would be a relatively close one, just because the Chargers typically don't travel east very well, and not a lot of teams do. But I was shocked that Keenan Allen didn't perform better. I thought he'd be leaned on quite a bit. He did get 8 targets, but I thought that he would flirt with be in double digits. And it just didn't look good, fellas.
Steve, he's in a similar situation as like Devontae Adams and DeAndre Hopkins, where you thought he'd at least get peppered with balls, but Mike Williams, who almost didn't even play on Sunday, led him in targets. It's like, like you said, Ben, very perplexing.
Yep. Next one is another egg on my face situation. I wasn't looking forward to this. I was just hoping you guys were going to keep talking about Keenan Allen.
We can skip this next one. This is just
great. All right, moving on. No, Arizona Cardinals quarterback we owe an apology to, and his name's Kyler Murray.
No.
He was aggregate projected QB8. We all sold, and we were all wrong. He ended up being QB5. And he was 26 of 40 for 230 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, but 13 rush attempts, 91 rush yards, and 1 rushing touchdown, all in a 24-20 win over San Fran. Kyler, for whatever reason, continues to torch that tough Niners defense, and he keeps getting better. In week 9 last year, he finished as QB7 against them. In week 11 last year, he finished as QB6 against them. This week, he finished as QB5. I'm man enough to admit that I was wrong about Kyler. Cliff Kingsbury clearly knows how to maximize his QB strengths. 0 chemistry issues with DeAndre Hopkins, and he's one of the most dynamic running quarterbacks in the NFL. I wish Browns head coach Kevin Stefanski would take a page out of Cliff's playbook in that regard. Good Lord. Anyways, Kyler and the Cards take their 1-0 record back to Arizona to host the surprisingly equally 1-0 Washington football team, whose defense looked pretty stout in week 1. I'll be watching Kyler closely in this one, because if he plays as well or better than he did in week 1, look out, because it could be that monster season that everybody was talking about.
I am not man enough to admit that I was wrong, so I'm not going to. Steve, you're up.
Hey, I was definitely wrong on this one, but I did mention that he played very well against them last year. But yeah. I was just really I just really had the belief that the San Francisco 49ers team, coming off of that stinging Super Bowl loss, with the whole offseason to prepare for just this week 1 matchup against Kyler Murray and the Arizona Cardinals. Yeah, I really didn't think that he was going to be able to finish where he finished. So kudos to him. And, hey, that's going to be a team that's going to be really exciting and fun to watch this season, apparently.
I will say, where I do feel like I was really wrong about somebody was DeAndre Hopkins. We always say that he's quarterback proof. And he's quarterback proof again. Like, why didn't I buy in more? Why didn't I buy in more?
And, if you listen to our preview podcast, we were actually among the minority in saying we weren't worried about his volume.
Yeah.
We expected that to be there. Christian Kirk, Larry Fitzgerald at this age, give me a break. But what we were concerned about was the quality of those targets. I believe that that Kyler had less yards per attempt than Deshaun Watson last year, was less accurate, had less touchdown to interception ratio. I mean, all the signs pointed to a bit of a quality regression versus what he experienced in Houston. What we did not take into consideration was that he was going from Bill O'Brien to Cliff Kingsbury. Guy who knows how to use the offensive weapons that he has. Missed that one. We apologize to you for sure, DeAndre.
What he may lack in depth of target and touchdown opportunities, he's making up for in volume.
Man, dude's a beast. And man, just seeing him in the locker room getting the game ball afterwards, man, I love football. I'm so glad it's back. Next up, we have now transitioned. Oh no, this is our second Total Foresight sell on this list. And it's a technical victory, but we'll talk more about it. Philadelphia Eagles running back Miles Sanders was initially, at the time we recorded our podcast, still questionable for the game, was aggregate projected RB8. We were selling that. We were obviously correct because he didn't play, and the Eagles did lose 17-27. Peek behind the curtain. The week one Miles Sanders situation and similar ones in previous years was a significant contributor in the decision to adjust our in-season pod schedule from having preview episodes air Thursday evenings now air on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. during the season. Plain and simple, we've made it harder on ourselves than it's had to be by trying to project the NFL week in full as of Thursday instead of Sunday. Going forward, guys like this will not make our list because we won't be reviewing our buys and sells until Sunday mornings. However, if we have a Thursday night football buy or sell, we will be sure to tweet those out prior to Thursday night football kickoffs. And the same goes for Steve if he has any Thursday night football spec stashes that week. The Eagles host the LA Rams in week 2, and per rotoworld.com on Monday, there's a quote, decent hope that Miles suits up in week 2. Decent hope versus that defensive front? Man, I don't know. And what a disappointing start to what had been such a promising season.
Completely agree. Very disappointing. Very disappointing, Ben. Boston Scott didn't really do much either in his absence. So, overall, it just... yeah, it is what it is. The Eagles offense I didn't expect much out of, so to race out to a 14-0 lead, you thought, hey, this is going to be nice, we're going to put it in cruise control, and then to lose to that Washington team who really did nothing offensively was just very sad. Just very sad. Moving on. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Steve, you can feel free to chime in. Just throw it.
For anyone who took Miles Sanders at the bottom of their first round, pre-injury concerns. Yeah, I feel for you right now. It's rough.
Yeah, Jay, on the bright side, you could be sitting with Miles Sanders and Kenny G instead of Miles Sanders and Julio Jones. So
that's
silver
true.
lining, man. Silver lining. Next up, we've got another sell of the week for Total Foresight, and we were talking about Dallas Cowboys wide receiver Amari Cooper. His aggregate projection was wide receiver 13, and we all sold, and we were all correct. He ended up as wide receiver 17. He did, however, have 10 receptions on 14 targets for 81 yards and a 17-20 loss to the LA Rams. Man, we were technically correct about Amari, but conceptually, we were kind of wrong. Amari got himself some web redemption on Jalen Ramsey to the tune of 10 receptions of 14 targets. I mean, I know some of that came in garbage time, but Coop and the Cowboys get a very nice matchup at home versus the Atlanta Falcons in week 2. And after what he showed me in week 1 versus Jalen Ramsey, garbage time or not, I'm looking for a monster Coop game in week 2.
I'll tell you, the volume was fantastic. The yardage, 8 yards per catch was, it's a little mediocre and pedestrian, but boy, if he gets in the end zone with that kind of volume, look out.
Yeah, and that's usually the thing with Cooper is, if he sees the targets, he usually performs fairly well. It's those games, right, when he's against a top flight corner where he's just not targeted a whole lot. And so that was nice to see out of him for sure. It helps kind of put stomps on any injury concerns you had as far as how they were treating him heading into the season. So yeah, I'm there with you, Benny. I think against the Falcons, I mean, this should just be one of those feast games. I have no idea what any of the DFS costs for any of these guys are going to be, but there's going to be a lot of Dallas Cowboy and Atlanta Falcons players in a lot of lineups.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
All right. Last sell of the week was New York Giants tight end Evan Ingram. Total Foresight and all of us were selling an aggregate projection of tight end 5. And man, were we correct. He ended up as tight end 36, even worse than Gronk, man. 2 receptions on 7 targets, though, for 9 yards. It was a 16-6 tough loss to Pittsburgh. And in a crazy week 1, I got to be honest, it was nice to have a they are who they thought we were guy in Evan Ingram to round out the week. We liked the talent. I really liked his target share, but I did not like that stout Pittsburgh defense, and we nailed it. There was nothing available for him all day. The G-men traveled to Detroit to take on the Lions in week 2, which saw Bears tight end Jimmy Graham rack up 7 targets and a touchdown in week 1. So if he can stay healthy, better days are ahead for Evan Ingram, primarily because his QB Daniel Jones looks legit to me.
You said it, man. Better days are ahead. He had a tough matchup, but the volume, the share is there. So yeah, he'll be fine.
Yep, right there with you guys. You like everything. It's just going into this one, it's like Minkah Fitzpatrick's going to be roaming around out there, and it's just not going to make it easy for a guy like Ingram.
Nope.
Absolutely. So, that is 22 total buys and sells in a crazy week 1. Total Foresight went 12-10. So did Jay and Steve. You guys did as well. I was the Lone Ranger at 11-11. So I'm a game back behind all of you. And we're all behind Travis, who participated on the side in our buys and sells for all of week 1. He ended up as 13-9. So 1 game ahead of all you guys and 2 games ahead of me. So that'll be a fun little thing to track with our friend of show, Travis, all season.
Oh, no. He's not invited back now. You don't come in and win. No. He's done. Moving on.
It's 1 week, and I expect a big rebound from myself and Total Foresight in week 2. I mean, 12-10, 11-11 in a crazy week 1, like that's fine. But we're here to be a little bit better than that, and yep. I'm going to make sure that we do everything to do that in week 2. So Jay, why don't we go ahead and take this opportunity for you to go over the unfortunate injury?
Oh boy, Ben, I know you wanted me to keep this to fantasy relevant guys and major injuries, but boy, the list is it's so long and it's so full of great players. So let me take a deep breath and run through this with you real quick. Marlon Mack, running back for the Colts, torn Achilles, out for the season. Blake Jarwin, tight end for the Cowboys, torn ACL, out for the season. Blake Jarwin was a guy we were especially excited about heading into the season. Lev Bell for the Jets, had a hamstring injury. There was some drama during the game where coach put him in too early. He played a handful of second half snaps before leaving the game. Now it's come out he's been placed on IR. Now, for this season, IR is a different beast. It just means that you have to sit out 3 weeks. So Lev Bell out a minimum of 3 weeks. Tight end David Njoku from the Browns, as well as you guys know, sprained MCL, also placed on IR, will be out for the next 3 weeks. Wide receiver Michael Thomas, wide receiver 1 in drafts for the Saints. High ankle sprain. Initially was thought that it wasn't going to be too bad and he was going to play through it. Now it's been determined that he's week to week and is likely to miss multiple games. San Francisco 49ers tight end George Kittle, knee sprain, suffered during the game. Still managed to play 61 of 62 snaps during that game. Both the Niners and Kittle are, quote, cautiously optimistic that he will be available for week 2. Running back James Conner, who we touched on earlier for the Steelers, suffered a sprained ankle, is considered day-to-day. Steve, I think you said the quote, it's believed that he avoided a high ankle sprain, and their coach is, quote, will, quote, leave the light on for him. So we'll see what that means, but it doesn't sound good. Wide receiver Devontae Parker from the Dolphins suffered a hamstring injury, aggravated an injury that he battled through camp and aggravated it late in the first half. He did play a handful of second half snaps before leaving the game, but is considered questionable and has started rehab on that hamstring today. So week 2 looks very iffy. Running back Phillip Lindsay of the Denver Broncos was set to have an MRI today on his toe. He has turf toe. I do not know the results of that MRI as of yet, as of this episode, but again, looks like it could be iffy and doubtful for week 2. Tight end Gerald Everett of the Rams has a back injury and is listed as questionable, left the game on Sunday. It does not seem to be serious. Coach Sean McVay was quoted as saying that that the team made it through with no serious injuries, but again, huge question mark heading into week 2. Wide receiver Cortland Sutton for the Broncos has an AC joint sprain. Nick Fangio, quote, hopes he can do more by the end of this week, but again, looks very doubtful for week 2. Kenny Golladay from the Lions, hamstring injury listed currently as questionable, missed week 1, and his current status is still up in the air. Brandon Cooks, who we touched on, has a quad injury, is considered day-to-day. He did practice on Monday, and it looks like he should be good to go for week 2. Duke Johnson, also ankle. He's a little bit more iffy heading into week 2. Then you have guys like Justin Jackson, who were key backups. He has a quad injury, is listed as day-to-day, but left the game Sunday, opening the door for Joshua Kelly, one of this week's top waiver adds. And then finally, I have Golden Tate of the New York Giants. You know, he was held out on Monday Night Football with a hamstring injury, and his status remains uncertain for week 2. That's a lot of big name and fantasy relevant guys.
And it's, you know, you were talking about it before the podcast and citing some stats about the lockout season. And it's just the nature of the beast. And when you have a COVID type season, you're going to have tons of these types of injuries. And, you know, it's unfortunate. You hate to see it, and hopefully it improves as the season goes on.
The war of attrition has begun, and we hope that you drafted deep and your bench is ready to go.
All right. Oh, go ahead, Steve-O.
I was going to say, yes, indeed. And all the more reason why there might not be any like mega blockbuster, you know, we all love it when there's that like straight up RB1 moving forward type of guy on the waiver wire, but it doesn't happen often. It didn't happen this week, but Jay just gave you a plethora of injuries covering all fantasy relevant positions. So no time like the present to do what you need to do to keep your fantasy season rolling and attack the waiver wire aggressively this week for the next couple of weeks.
Yes, and the best part of this show, Steve's waiver ads, is coming up in just a second. But as a little bit of a bonus, we covered, but in all of our buys and sells, we touched on 12 total teams in the NFL. I went through and I looked at the rest of the league, and I came away with 25 bullet points that I want to share with everyone just in my observations of week 1, because in the off season, there are certain narratives and variables on each team for each player that drastically impact our fantasy projections for their season-long outlook. With that in mind, here are 25 very relevant but quick hitting observations I found very interesting in week 1. And this is going in alphabetical order. So for Atlanta, Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, and Russell Gage each had 12 targets, 9 receptions, and over 100 yards receiving. Came a little bit at the detriment to Hayden Hurst, so we'll see how that looks going forward. And per rotoworld.com, Todd Gurley played just 45% of snaps. So that's something to look out for and see how that progresses. And guys, if you have anything to interject, do not hesitate. Jump in at any time. Don't hesitate to interrupt me because I'm just going to keep going fast otherwise. Moving on to Arizona, Chase Edmonds had 9 total touches versus Kenyon Drake's 18 and had 3 more targets than Drake. I found that interesting and surprising. For Baltimore, Mark Ingram only rushed 10 times for 29 yards. Dobbins had just 3 less touches. Gus Edwards logged 4, and Patrick Ricard logged 2. Again, just little interesting tidbits. In Buffalo, Devin Singletary and Zach Moss had nearly an exact 50-50 split in total touches. Singletary had 14 and Moss had 12, but Moss got in the end zone through the air. And check this out. Josh Allen had the lone rushing touchdown, and he was also second in pass attempts with 46 and 10th in pass accuracy at almost 72%. What? Now, I acknowledge that was against the New York Jets, but he is now on my radar as somebody who may be a capable passer. So it'll be interesting to see what he does next week. Now, next we've got in Carolina, Talk about surprising. DJ Moore did lead with 9 targets, but both Curtis Samuel and Robbie Anderson each had 8 targets. Robbie led them all in receptions, catch rate, receiving yards, yards per target, yards per reception, and he had the lone wide receiver touchdown. So maybe familiarity in that offense means something after all, huh? And then in Cincinnati, I was pleasantly surprised in our league of record to see that AJ Green was the clear target leader among Bengals wide receivers. He had 9 versus 5 for 5 each for Tyler Boyd and John Ross, who apparently is their number 3 wide receiver. There was some question mark about, Auden Tate, the guy they drafted. I can't remember his name offhand. And John Ross, T. Higgins, that's it. Tyler Boyd. So it was understood that Tyler Boyd and AJ Green are going to be the, 1A and 1B. And it looks like the 1A is definitely AJ Green. But then it was like, okay, is it Auden Tate? Is it John Ross? Is it T. Higgins? And it looks like John Ross is the answer to that question, which is very interesting in Cleveland.
As long as he stays healthy.
Very true. All fair. But before he went out last year, he balled out.
That's
and now
true.
that he's the number 3 receiver,
Yep.
if Joe Burrow figures it out a little bit more, it'll be interesting to see what he does. Moving on to Cleveland. Coach. 3 Browns running backs averaged 5 yards per carry, 5.5 yards per carry, and 6 yards per carry. And yet we run the ball 24 total times. Like, that should be Nick Chubb's total. And then Hunt should have another 15 to 20. And then if you want to give another running back some carries, God bless, go ahead, do it. But man, run the ball more. Come on now. Look like Freddie Kitchens out there. Give me a break with that stuff. Next up, we've got Dallas. Amari Cooper had a 25.6% target share, 14 targets to Coop, 16 to Lamb, and 5 to Gallup. Now, there was that one called back on Gallup, a good acting job out of Jalen Ramsey. That could have changed things a little bit. But it's just interesting to note that target share. And now all of a sudden, unfortunately, with Blake Jarwin going down, when you look at Randall Cobb and Jason Witten from last year and all the targets that they vacated, that was why we were so excited about Blake Jarwin. Are all those now going to go to tight end Dalton Schultz? I don't know, but if they don't, that means there's even more targets up for grab for these 3 stud wide receivers. So keep that in mind as you're evaluating Dallas going forward. In Denver, like Jay mentioned, Phillip Lindsay is dealing with turf toe, and that's all Melvin Gordon needed to shine last night. He had 5.2 yards per carry versus Lindsay's 3.4. He out-touched Lindsay 18-8. Even better, after Lindsay's exit, Royce only stole 2 touches from him. So it looks like Melvin Gordon's the real deal, and he figured out how to breathe in Mile High. At Green Bay, we talked a little bit about A.J. Dillon this offseason. That man was just 4th in running back touches with 2. Aaron Jones led with 22, and Jamal Williams was 2nd with 11. And on the wide receiver side, it was interesting to note that MVS was the 2nd most targeted Packer wide receiver with 6. And I got a sneaky suspicion he's going to be among the guys Steve's going to be talking about here in a second. And then in Indiana, for the Colts, Paris Campbell led all Colts wide receivers in receptions, receiving yards, and tied for 1st in wide receiver targets with 9. And Nyheim Hines tied Jonathan Taylor in total touches. Man, a little bit sleeping wrong on Nyheim Hines over here on my part. Be interesting to see how that backfield looks going forward. I was quite honestly surprised at a diminished amount of usage for Jonathan Taylor, especially after Marlon Mack left the game with injury. So says a lot about how that team and how Phillip Rivers felt about Nyheim Hines. So in Jacksonville, Chris Thompson, James Robinson dominated the running back touches, logging 17 total. The next closest running back, Chris Thompson, had just 2. And look who it is. Wide receiver Keelan Cole led all Jacksonville wide receivers in targets, receptions, catch rate, receiving yards, and touchdowns. DJ Shark is still the wide receiver 1 in this offense, but don't sleep on Keelan Cole, baby. Remember that awesome one-handed catch he had last year, and this guy has shown talent in several years in a row now. He just needs the opportunity. LA Chargers, they ran the ball 39 times. They passed just 30 times. I thought that was interesting for what it's worth. The LA Rams, Malcolm Brown out-touched Cam Akers 21-15, was far more productive with his opportunities and got into the end end zone twice. Another guy I think Steve's about to be talking about here in just a second. In Las Vegas, I wasn't sure how it was going to look for Darren Waller with all those new wide receivers, but he was still first in targets with 8. And man, surprisingly and scarily on the running back front, Josh Jacobs was second with 6. If all of a sudden we can start counting on that guy to get 4, 5, 6 targets a game, look out with his upside, because we were projecting him as a guy that didn't catch passes, based on what he had done last year. They came out and said that they were going to, but they just kept bringing in pass catching running backs. Their actions was contradicting their words. So, that and all the wide receivers, it made you wonder, but hey, you can only go off of what you saw. And it will be interesting to see what he does next week. Ruggs led all of their Las Vegas wide receivers with 5 targets, which I thought was interesting. Brian Edwards was a total disappointment. We'll see if he recovers at all next week. Next up in Miami, Myles Gaskin led all running backs in touches with 13 after Jordan Howard was limited by a hamstring. Breida had 5 rushes and no targets. Gaskin led all running backs with 4 targets, and Patrick Laird had 2. That backfield just got very uninteresting for me. I'm good there. In Minnesota, and I love you, Jordan Howard, but you're ouchie now, and I can't. So in Minnesota, Dalvin Cook gets in the end zone twice, but he only out-touched Madison 13-10. Wide receiver BC Johnson was second in their wide receiver targets, receptions, and yards. So I thought that was noteworthy, especially because you got Justin Jefferson there. In New England, only 2 wide receivers were even targeted in week 1. Edelman had 7 and N'Keal Harry had 6. I think if I remember correctly, Cam only threw the ball 19 or 20 times, something crazy like that. In New Orleans, check out these target leaders. Kamara had 8, Cook had 7, and Manny Sanders and Michael Thomas had 5 apiece. And now that Michael Thomas is on IR for the next 3 weeks, he's probably set to lead that team in wide receiver targets. For the New York Giants, Darius Slayton is the undoubted wide receiver 1 in that offense. He looked great on Monday Night Football to me, and he tied Saquon with 9 targets. So if he's available in your league out there, man, go get him, but he's probably not. New York Jets, like Jay said, Lev Bell is now on IR. Frank Gore, anyone? If they can stay healthy, Crowder and Herndon may be the only fantasy relevant players on this offense, as they combined for 20 targets, which accounted for 57% of Sam Darnold's targets. In Philadelphia, Dallas Goedert led all Eagles with 9 targets. Ertz, Greg Ward, and Djax each had 7. So Carson Wentz is clearly distributing the ball very evenly there. In Tennessee, Corey Davis tied A.J. Brown in targets with 8 and did far more with those targets than A.J. did. And there were quiet rumbles all offseason that he was still the team's best wide receiver. And that's how it looked this past week. In Washington, another guy I bet Steve's going to be bringing up, tight end Logan Thomas led the team in targets with 8 and converted that to tight end 7 on the week. I believe that at least touches on every team in the NFL. And if nothing else, I felt like that was important to do in week 1, especially compared to the way we were viewing people, heading into the season. So hopefully that sounded okay and proves to be some valuable information for everyone.
Absolutely. And you know what? I think that ties in beautifully to Steve's next piece, who, you touched on a lot of the opportunities for guys now with injuries or the way things kind of broke week 1. So I'm interested to hear in the deep dive Steve has for us on who he's targeting on his waiver wire list.
And, before I get going on that list, it should go without say, but it's got to be said anyways. Whenever you're thinking about like who you want to target, how much fab you're going to throw at them, is it worth using a waiver priority if that's the system that your league uses? Bear in mind, you target the positions that you have in need. Guys that went down with injuries, you're trying to fill in a running back, receiver, or maybe you have no depth at receiver and you need to add a guy. So you always kind of want to come at it with that angle. So maybe you might spend a little more in fab than maybe another team would, excuse me, if it is a position of need. So just kind of always want to throw that out there, because I do kind of have like my own little fab recommendations, but just bear in mind that I'm not saying this is the only amount of fab that you could spend on these players. Also, this is based on $100 fab budget, because that's fairly common in a lot of leagues. So Um, and last bit of housekeeping, guys that are around 30% roster share or less. Just because I could say, like I tweeted out earlier today, hey, Dallas Goedert, you should add him. Well, yeah, he's already rostered in about 60% of leagues. He's not someone that people can readily go out and get available. I mean, guys, if you're anyone listening to this, watching this, you're passionate about fantasy football. You probably play in competitive leagues. So, trying to bring you players that you are likely going to be able to go and like throw a fab bid down and possibly add. So we'll just kick it off with the only quarterback I have. And Jay, you have to love this, but Gardner Minshew, dude, he threw 3 times more touchdowns than he did in completions. Went 19 of 20, but threw 3 touchdowns. And the beautiful thing was, he had a great week, and it was only off of 20 attempts. I'm looking forward to seeing him in a game script that forces him to throw the ball a lot. And he still threw in 19 yards on the ground. As far as fab goes, depending on your quarterback situation, he might be worth throwing $5 at, but it's a quarterback, so you're not going to spend a lot, if anything. Maybe even $1 or a $0 bid might do it for you. Moving on to the position that we all want to talk about the most, I will start out with Nyheim Hines, running back, Indianapolis Colts. As of writing this, just rostered in 20% of leagues. I will say he might have hit his ceiling as far as like a weekly performance in week 1, because he got in the end zone twice. I don't know if he has more than half a dozen touchdowns in him for the season, but the bigger thing was getting those 8 targets out of Phillip Rivers. So now are the Colts going to throw the ball 46 times, was it, like every single week? I doubt it, but I think that Hines, especially with Marlon Mack out for the year, certainly has a role. He should be good for 4 to 6 grabs each and every week. And in PPR, I just feel like he's going to be a solid flex play every single week. So if you need a running back, for me, he's probably worth throwing like $25, maybe even $30 if you really need it, because I think that he's going to give you a really solid floor, and he will have a few more weeks this season where he does see closer to that 8 reception mark, or he might get in the end zone and provide you, a week where you have a guy who finishes in the RB2 range. Moving on to Malcolm Brown, running back of the Los Angeles Rams. And yes, you're correct, Ben. We will discuss him. Currently rostered in 20% of leagues. 27% of leagues. He, at least to me, looked like head and shoulders above the other running backs for the Los Angeles Rams Sunday night. Looked sharp, had nearly 80 yards on the ground, got the goal line work, scored twice. Cam Akers still saw a fair amount of work, and Darrell Henderson is going to be factoring in throughout the year. So, and it's hard to get behind. Malcolm Brown, I think, scored twice in the opener last year too. So it's hard to really want to think he's going to run away with the job, but who knows? Maybe he could. Todd Gurley was still on the team last season. So, for me, probably worth $20 to $25 in fab. We just saw James Conner might not play, but the light still is left on for him. And we know that Lev Bell's out. So there are teams out there that lost, RB1s and 2s on their roster. And if you need a guy that is going to probably be the bell cow for the most part next week, I think we can count on that out of Malcolm Brown, at least heading into week 2. Moving on to Benny Snell Jr., Pittsburgh Steelers running back, currently only rostered in 17% of leagues. Ben, you said it. Yeah, he looked like a stud. Came into camp slimmed down. They were comparing that to like what Lev Bell did from year 1 to year 2. And he certainly looked the part as an NFL running back last night. The only tricky thing is with this one, guys, is the light has been left on. So I feel like, if you have James Conner on your roster, you're going to probably throw more than just 5 to 10 fab dollars at Benny Snell Jr. But I think even if you don't, and even if he doesn't get the start, he looks like he'd be a very valuable stash guy on your bench, because I think we'd all agree. Do we have any faith that James Conner is going to play a full slate of games this season? So you just kind of feel like with Snell waiting in the wings, if you get starts out of Benny Snell moving forward, that he's probably going to be a really good running back for you. So again, adjust what you'd be willing to spend based on what you need. And I think you throw maybe double that if you have James Conner on your, maybe even more, because that's a prime insurance policy for a guy who just, you could swap him out as your RB2. It's like whoever's in that lineup, you could feel good about as your RB2. I feel like maybe even better with Snell, the way he looked last night compared to Conner. Moving on to another guy we talked about, Joshua Kelly. You mentioned it, Jay. He was able to kind of sneak in and look to solidify that RB2 role on the Chargers. You have Austin Eckler. As good as Eckler has looked at times, we know that he's not a guy who's going to handle 20 carries every single week. He's just not going to be built for it. Kelly, he's your bigger bruising. He got the goal line work. He was the guy that got in the end zone, 12 carries, 60 yards, scored a touchdown. If you own Austin Eckler, you might want to get Joshua Kelly on your roster. He's only on 13% of rosters, by the way. And he's somebody who could give you some standalone value, too, if you need it. If bye weeks, you're in a pinch, you could flex him. So for me, $5 to $10 fab. He looks like he could be a more valuable stash insurance policy kind of a guy for your team. The newer but younger Frank Gore, Adrian Peterson, running back of the Detroit Lions, rostered in only 26% of leagues, touched the ball 21 total times for 113 yards, and looked good doing it. However, we've seen him flash here and there in some of these games, especially early in seasons, the last couple of years. So for me, he doesn't have like the upside that maybe a Joshua Kelly would or a Benny Snell Jr. would on your bench. But if you're looking for immediate help because you lost Le'Veon Bell and you don't want to go with the other elder statesman of the NFL and Frank Gore, and you want to go with Adrian Peterson, hey, there's nothing wrong with that. And again, for me, probably $5 to $10 fab. Heading to the wide receivers. For me, probably top ad is Paris Campbell, wide receiver on the Indianapolis Colts, only rostered on 23% of teams. Got targeted 9 times, caught 6 of those for a team-high 71 yards, also got a carry for 9 yards, and, it resulted in a 14-point PPR day. And, he didn't get in the end zone, but he does look like the bigger, faster, new T.Y. Hilton on that team. That's kind of what's been holding him back his rookie season. It was a second-round draft pick. He just, was dealing with injuries all last season. You just like to see him get that target share, and he looks instantly like he might be the best wide receiver on that team. So for me, if you need a wide receiver, I have no problem throwing $25, $30 fab at him to get him on your team, because for me, he's instantly a guy that you would feel comfortable, at the very least, putting in your wide receiver 3 spot. I'm higher on this next guy than I have read or heard about anybody else the last couple of days, but Russell Gage, maybe it's because it's one of my guys, one of those stash guys, but a wide receiver of the Atlanta Falcons. I've seen his roster share skyrocket from 1% to 2% as of this morning. In other words, if you want him, you can probably get him and do so for very cheap as far as fab goes. But the thing is, you mentioned it, Ben, in your the interesting stats that you gave. The guy got 12 targets. And he caught 9 of them for 114. And at the end of the day, the reason I talked about him as a stash last week was he's raved about in training camp what a step he took from year 2 to this being his 3rd year for the Atlanta Falcons at wide receiver, and he plays a slot. And we've seen Mohamed Sanu in that same spot on the same offense be successful in fantasy football. And I think after what we saw in week 1, anytime that they are playing a team that's going to be able to put up points against them, we could see it just become a regular thing where Matt Ryan has to throw the ball 50 plus times. And if he does, his slot wide receiver, I don't think he's going to get a dozen every week. Of course he won't. And Hayden Hurst will grow into a role, and I think that number then drops for Gage. But I think you could probably bank on him being 6 to 8 targets every week. And just as a PPR machine, that's somebody that's nice to have, again, as someone you could flex if you need him. So if you need wide receiver depth, I like him as a pickup guy that you add to your bench, and you can use him when you need to, or in matchups that you target where you think there's going to just be a ton of passing like we saw on Sunday. And for me, I mean, you could probably throw $5 fab, 10 most, and surely get him. I would have to think. And a guy that you mentioned too, Benny, when it came to some of the stats you gave, Robbie Anderson, wide receiver, Carolina Panthers. He's right on that roster bubble, 30% mark of guys I like to talk about. And you already mentioned what he did Sunday. For me, I'd probably spend $10 to $15 fab. I don't know if it'll be him that's the number 2 every single week in that offense, but he did it this past week, and that's what you're kind of looking for out of him. And so next we'll go MVS, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, wide receiver of the Green Bay Packers, only rostered 9% of leagues. He had a couple of drops, but he still caught 4 for 96 yards and a touchdown. And we all are still looking for somebody. And Allen Lazard had a good game too. So we're still looking for who's going to be that number 2 receiver in that Green Bay offense. But hey, if you're like a lot of teams right now, guys, that are suffering from all those soft tissue injuries around the league that are hitting all these wide receivers, shoulder injuries, whatever the case may be, a lot of big name receivers out that Jay mentioned. If you're just looking for somebody for next week, even they play the Detroit Lions, and we already talked about the 0 secondary help that they have. I mean, they have nothing going on right now. So all Green Bay Packers wide receivers should be feasting in that contest. So he's somebody that, hey, maybe throw $5 in fab just to get him. If you need a spot start, throw him in there and just, hey, that's a good roll of the dice if you ask me. Last wide receiver before I get to the one tight end that I have is Laviska Shenault Jr. Wide receiver, Jacksonville Jaguars, only rostered in 12% of leagues. Got 5 of the 20 available targets, like our guy Keelan Cole did as well. But it was also just nice with Shenault Jr. just watching the way, they moved him all over the field. They used him in various ways. And you could just tell that they like what they have in him and they want to utilize him. Kind of almost reminds me a little bit of like a Tyreek Hill type in his rookie season. So again, not somebody like if you wouldn't have scored a touchdown, you wouldn't have wanted to start him. But he's somebody that like, hey, for $5, it's worth a pickup and just kind of putting him aside. And we talked about a lot of positive game scripts we could see for that Jacksonville passing game moving forward. And then, yeah, Ben, you're absolutely right. Logan Thomas, tight end for the Washington football team, only rostered 2% of leagues. And I'm sorry, any tight end that's getting targeted 8 times in a game, your antenna has to go up, and that gets on your radar really quick. Scored a touchdown. And this is a guy that I have to admit, I didn't hear this, but of course, seeing that target share and then reading up a little bit more about him, converted quarterback, athletic guy, and was just raved about throughout training camp. And they really thought they'd have something with him. So you saw him get targeted 8 times. So if you need a tight end, he's probably the much cheaper. He's available, and he's going to be the cheaper option over a Dallas Goedert, who you probably will have to throw down a reasonable amount of fab to get him if he's available in your league. And then, Ben, the only defense that I have, and you mentioned them as well. So I feel like, yes, a lot of all this, the injuries, Ben's stats, all that kind of ties into this stuff. The Washington football team, they're only rostered in 5% of leagues, and 8 sacks, 2 interceptions, fumble recovery. They scored a fair amount of points as a DST this past week in a matchup that no one would have wanted to touch them with. So they play the Arizona Cardinals, and I know that that's going to be one that's going to scare some people off, but so did the Philadelphia Eagles. And, we do have the younger, possibly more turnover-prone quarterback in Kyler Murray. So, hey, if you're streaming defenses and you need somebody, you could probably put a $0 bid on them or just maybe throw $1 to make sure you get them. But, hey, that's the defense I have. And that's going to wrap it up, fellas. And like I said a little earlier, if you need it, just spend what you have to this week. You don't want to start out slow in your league because it'll get away from you quick, and the money's not going to help you later on when your season's shot. So if you need help, spend what you have to get these guys on your roster.
Yep.
Absolutely. Great episode, guys. I mean, it's a fun week 1. It's always fun to review ourselves, hold ourselves accountable, and look back at how we did. And then it's really important to pay attention to everything that's going on, keep all the injuries in mind. And like Steve said, it all comes together to help you make your decision on your waiver wire in the all important week 1. Like sometimes I feel like we might have the tendency to just wait until that super obvious RB1 type, like Steve alluded to earlier, is out there and just staring you in the face because nobody saw it coming, but all of a sudden he got an opportunity and he's amazing and everybody in front of him got injured. that's great if that happens, but you can't really bank on that. And you need to be focused on your team and your needs and what you need to help you win in week 2. I mean, that's how I'm approaching the waiver wire this week. There's 3 guys already cut off my roster so that everybody knows that I'm going to be busy. So, I advise you to do the same. Don't be shy. Have fun with it. Either one of you got anything to add before we get out of here?
Nope. Can't wait to get into week 2, guys. You know what? We have more football ahead of us. Turning around Browns-Bengals Thursday night. Let's go.
And maybe, I believe for the first time ever, Sunday morning. 10 a.m.
That's what I was about to say. I'm looking forward to actually just being like, got that good Sunday morning football vibe going on. And then podcast.
I don't have to finalize. You're right. I usually finalize our list of buys and sells on Wednesday night to get it out to the guys ahead of time for recording on Thursday. Now I'm not going to have to do that until Saturday night, Sunday morning. Yeah, I think that's going to help us a little bit. So I am super looking forward to delivering all the buys and sells for week 2 and then hearing Steve's spec stashes as well. Can't wait.
And that wraps up this episode of Fantasy Foresight, the podcast. We thank you for joining us. Be sure to visit us, as always, at fantasyforesight.com. Use the links at the bottom of the page to find us across social media, including Twitter,